Okay, well, welcome to everyone who has joined here today. We're so glad to have you here. So glad that you have made it to this second of our summer seminars. Just as a reminder to all of you, as an organization, we really want to do everything we can throughout the year to invest in our team, to invest in the theological and the biblical development of our team. And so these seminars are just one of the ways that we want to do that, sharpen our thinking. So if you weren't here for the last summer seminar, Sam Storms taught on eschatology. And so that summer seminar will be up soon on the Mustard Seed Network YouTube channel. So I'd encourage you to check it out. But today, I'm really excited to be able to welcome Jen Wilkin to share in our summer seminar for today. But Jen, before you get started, I want to take just a minute and share a little bit about what the seminar is about. And what it's not about. This is not a seminar on the topic of complementarianism. We're starting this seminar with the assumption that our churches are, by biblical conviction, complementarian. And so just to be clear, what we mean by that is that God has created men and women as image bearers of himself, that we are equal in value and in dignity and in worth, but that God has created man and he's created woman to have distinct and complementary roles, specifically in the home and in the church. And in the church particularly, that God has given qualified men to be the ones who assume the role of elder. But that's not what Jen will be teaching on today. If you do have questions about that, I would encourage you to talk to your your team supervisor. But Jen, before we talk about the issues at hand today, would you mind just giving us a little introduction? Who are you? What's your family like? Where are you serving? What are you doing?
Yeah, I am actually currently serving at my home church of the Village in the role of executive director of our Next Gen Family and Care Ministries. And I've gone through various roles at the Village that probably will be part of what we talk about. I think when Chad Farmer and I first met, I was either not employed there or was a part-time hourly employee on the communications team. So I just celebrated my 10-year anniversary on staff at the Village in March. I am the mother of 4 children. I'm married to Jeff. We just celebrated our 29th anniversary, and we have 2 pugs, which are really the only 2 dogs you ever need. And yeah, my kids are all grown, and we have a 5th child who became a member of our family about 8 years ago. She's the same age as my daughter Claire, so we're numbering our kids at 5 these days, and we're thrilled about it. And also a grandbaby who is currently mutinously living in Korea, but will return home in a couple of years. So yeah, two married kids.
That's great. And so at your role right now at the Village, what do you actually kind of do on a normal weekly, monthly rhythm?
Well, one of the things that I have always wanted, I raised my children at the Village Church, and so have always hoped that I could bring some of the structure and organization that I had built out in women's Bible study and discipleship areas to other areas of the church as well. And so one of the things that we've been able to do is build out an educational scope and sequence for birth through 12th grade that funnels into our young adult programming. We've thought about what we want disciples to be learning at various developmental stages all the way through. And so that's been really, really fun. And then family ministry is an opportunity for us to do ministry for everyone from young adults all the way to senior adults. And then with care ministry, that's something I've cared about for a long time, no pun intended. But care ministry is particularly important to me because it's ministry to the most vulnerable among us. And if you're familiar at all with the Village, you may know that we have not always been great at that, but we have gotten a lot better at it over the last 8 or 9 years. And I've gotten to contribute to that as someone who cared very deeply about my home church being a place where women and children in particular are safe.
And then outside of your role at the church, you've also been involved in writing and in speaking. In your mind, what's been the thrust? What's been the the goals that you've had for that particular ministry?
Yeah, well, honestly, the thing that I still love the most and that I still do at the church is I lead our women's Bible study space, and I oversee the curriculum writing. And for the last, 20 years, I've been an advocate. Well, actually almost 30 now, I guess. I've been an advocate for Bible literacy in the church, specifically among female spaces, because over the last 30 or 40 years, those spaces have not been marked by literacy building contributions. They were marked more by resources that targeted women at the feelings level. And so I had a hope to restore a thinking faith to women through giving them literacy tools to understand the Bible as a book. Obviously, the Bible is much more than a book, but it is at the very least a book. So rather than have passive recipients of someone's expert knowledge of the scriptures, I want them to have tools so that they can mine the scriptures themselves.
Okay. So that's now, but if you could walk us through it just really shortly before we get in, like with the journey of how did all of this begin? Like what's been your journey over the years in teaching and leading in the church and beyond?
Well, I graduated from college with a master's in business and a bachelor in English. And I specifically got the business degree because I didn't want to be a teacher. I had a ton of public educators in my family, and I was like, that is hard work and they are not paid what they should be. So don't I sound like I was so nice when I was 21? So I got the MBA so that I could get a real job. I did that I had a job in marketing for about 3 years before I had my first child and ended up staying home. At which point I got involved in a women's Bible study at my local church, just as a reason to, meet other women, have a reason to put on clothes and leave the house. And I got there and I started to realize over the course of time that the tools that I had learned in my English degree were tools that were applicable to studying the scriptures, but that not everyone knew that. And so I began to just step into a place where I saw a void in the way that women were being resourced. At the time, I don't think that I would have realized that it was not just women, but it was certainly more pronounced among women. And so I was just a lay leader trying to run toward a need. And my husband always teases me. He says, yeah, you didn't want to become a teacher because it didn't pay, and then you proceeded to teach for free for 25 years. So not good at math, I guess. But so I started just in a lay capacity. And when my kids were 5, 4, 3, and 1, the church offered me a part-time role running the women's ministry. And they offered to hire me at 12 hours a week because they knew that that was about all I had to give to it. And I often look back on that. That would have been around 1998. And I think about how forward thinking they were to do that, to give me, it was not a time where women had flexible roles in any workplace setting. And they found a way to meet me where I had capacity. And then the amount of time I was giving to it grew as my children got a little bit older. So that was my first iteration, was at my church in Houston. And I was there part-time for 5 years, part-time really by choice. At some point, because I just knew I didn't want to feel like I had to give more than 20, 25 hours a week. So yeah, then came to Dallas and didn't have a place to teach at the Village. If you know what the Village was like when we got here in 2007, they did not have women's ministry and they were not particularly friendly to the idea. So I taught in my living room and then eventually did teach for 2 years at the Village. At which point they were experiencing explosive growth and weren't really sure how to handle it from a discipleship standpoint. And then Josh Patterson, who is my dear friend, read a book called Simple Church, and they cleared the calendar of everything that was not weekend services and home groups, and that included women's Bible study. So we shut down a room of 550 women, and I started teaching in the community with their blessing. Did that for 6 years before a door opened again to do it at
ドーナツと一緒に頼んで、このサイズアップでお願いしたいんですけど、このシュガードーナツと、オーツミルクラテのショートでトールになるかな。じゃあショートで。
See if we can mute.
はい。じゃあはい。じゃあショート頼んで。
Okay, there we go. Sorry. Jen, are you there?
Yeah.
Okay. So if you don't mind, if I could transition to kind of the topic at hand. Let me kind of start, even if almost as a confession, by saying this. So I'm just speaking personally for me and for our church by saying this. If I identified a guy in our church who I thought was gifted in leadership and he was Christ-like, I could probably tell you a plan of, okay, here's how we're going to invest in him. Here's how we want to disciple him and meet with him, help him grow, and then slowly provide opportunities for him to grow in leadership and to find his sweet spot in ministry and in practicing his gift and serving God here in the local church. I don't know if it's the case for everyone, but at least for us in Nagoya, if we had a similar lady in our church, which we do, many of them, I don't think we do as good of a job in actually identifying who they are, discipling them, helping them grow in leadership, and then helping them find their actual role. But we do want to grow in that. We want to improve. So could take as much time as you like, but give us your thoughts. How can we as churches improve in developing and discipling women in our churches, and specifically those who are leaders, and finding ways for them to serve faithfully in the body?
Well, I wish I could say I'm surprised to hear you make the statement that you would know how to disciple a male who had leadership potential, and you wouldn't potentially know intuitively how to do that with a female leader. But that's actually a very common report that I hear. And I think the first thing we need to recognize is how we value the contributions of women differently than the contributions of men. I always like to point out that when I'm talking about these issues, there are actually no villains in my story. I don't look back over my own experience of the church and say, there were people in leadership who were willfully trying to suppress the gifts of women. I don't believe that. But I can say that I had a father who treated me as an intellectual equal and an interesting conversation partner and celebrated my strengths. I had 4 brothers who did the same thing, and I married a man who treated me the same way. And really the first place that I encountered a different treatment of my gifts or strengths was in the local church. My contributions there were seen instead of as things that weren't necessary and essential to the mission of God. They were seen as nice things that could be added if it felt like there was somewhere to put them. And so the gifting of women so often is viewed simply as nice but not necessary, instead of as essential and indispensable to the mission. Although we would say intellectually, we have an intellectual understanding that the Lord does not give gifts that are not needful to the body. Like he's not just throwing gifts to people and saying, you know what, you don't really have to use that. And so my own experience was that I had a leadership gift and I had a teaching gift, and neither of those things was an easy fit in the local church because they were often seen as being in competition with the gifts of men who were in leadership, or they were just seen as not necessary because we had men who were already doing those things. Which brings up another really important point, is that women are going to bring a unique perspective often to a leadership role that is sometimes lacking in the church. I would say is often lacking in the church. I can't understate the significance of our embodied experience of the world. The embodied experience of a man and a woman are not the same. Men grow to outgrow physical vulnerability in a way that women are biologically not designed to. So if I were to ask the men on this call, the question that I've asked my husband before, when you're walking down a dark alley, what are you thinking? My husband would respond to me, I'm thinking, where did I park my car? But if I ask that to the women on this call, they could tell you immediately, oh, I'm hypervigilant. I'm pretending to talk on my phone. I've got my keys tucked between my fingers in case someone attacks me because I'm supposed to be able to use them as brass knuckles if I need to. And this is because women understand into adulthood that they are capable of being overpowered. Not only that, but because we are capable of bearing children, think about a 9-month pregnant woman. Even if she has a black belt in karate, she's not going to be able to roundhouse kick someone and drop them. I don't actually know if that's a karate move or not. I'm making stuff up now. She's not going to be able to do that when she's 9 months pregnant. Pregnancy is a form of programmed weakness in adulthood that women experience, vulnerability. And so I think there are very real implications from this that you can track sociologically. If you were to look at like an article on Psychology Today as an example of something that I've come across that talks about the differences in social behaviors of women and men. And what we see is actually not that surprising if you think about what I'm talking about, this embodied reality. And if you think about it along the lines of the lion and the ant, okay, so I'm going to give an extreme example of something that we see to a lesser degree between men and women. The lion, it has physical dominance. He's an alpha predator. He can hunt alone if he wants to. He can act independently. But then the ant understands vulnerability and has to work in community with others to be able to accomplish work, understands that connectivity matters. And so when we think about transposing this onto the lived experience of men and women, it begins to make more sense why women go, hey, I'm going to the bathroom. Do you want to come with me? Like, that's a silly example, but everybody knows that that's a thing that women do typically. And who knows that there isn't something subconscious going on there. Women have a low level understanding that we tend to thrive in packs more than we do alone. When I think about the dark alley illustration, I'd much rather be with 4 other women than just in an alley by myself. So we just inhabit the world in different ways. And it means that when you look at the decision making differences between men and women, men tend to be more directive, to be more straight line logic in their thinking. Women, on the other hand, tend to be more holistic. They tend to think in terms of networks and relationships. They ask a different set of questions. These are generally true things. They are not universally true, but they're generally observable. So to give an example, let's say that a man steals from a pharmacy to get medicine for his wife who is dying. A male decision-making pattern would be to say he broke the law and he should be punished. A female decision-making pattern would be to say, well, but how do his relationships play into this? I mean, it was his wife. She needed the medicine. Did the pharmacist know what his situation was? And so the ways that men and women sometimes process moral dilemmas can be shaped by their embodied realities. Women understand vulnerability into adulthood. I would argue one of the key ways that we've seen this play out is in the number of females who are engaged in foreign missions. I think that women have a top of mind awareness of the vulnerable and they run toward it. I think that's why we see women serving in typical roles in the local church that are related to other women and children. But I also think that it means we need to think about what happens in leadership rooms that are all male or that are almost entirely male, because it means that in all likelihood, there's only one form of decision making and one reference point that is playing out. And so this is actually pretty personal for me. This is something that we had happen at my own church. We had a process for dealing with church discipline that was logical and straight line, and it did not take into account a holistic understanding of vulnerability or of relationships. And so we were misdiagnosing as a troubled marriage, often what was actually an abusive marriage. And so we were not handling abuse cases in ways that recognized that the woman was in a vulnerable place. We saw her as, well, they're both equal players in this. And so she needs to work on her stuff and he needs to work on his stuff. At which point the man, who enjoyed autonomy and also had a lot of authority because of the way that we thought about theology, would go home and tell her, you need to work on your stuff. You need to work on your stuff. You need to work on your stuff. The whole time it was a power imbalance, and he just was using what we were giving him from a discipline standpoint to be more emotionally abusive than he was before he came into the meeting. It was not until we started introducing the voices of women into those spaces that we grew in our understanding and our IQ about how those things can play out. And it took just a very sad and terrible public miscarriage of a case for us to learn that. But I thank God for that providence on a regular basis. I thank God that the woman in that situation was willing to go and tell her story to whoever would hear it, because it was a severe mercy on us, and it was the beginning of change. So I mention that because anytime I start talking about women in leadership roles, I think that what people can hear is, oh, this is about women's empowerment and about getting women on the org chart in the right spot. And what I always want to make clear is that this is about the vulnerable having a voice. That's what it's about. I am never sitting in the executive team meeting thinking, how can I be a big deal in this space? What I'm always thinking is, how can I speak on behalf of those who will never be in this space and who very much need me to represent where they're coming from? So if you're a man in leadership, I would urge you to consider that you need the input of women. You need our particular perspective, because in all likelihood, you may have some understanding, but you may not have enough. So you're going to need our input, but you also need our relational capital, because we are probably better connected to what's going on in the church because we are relationally driven than you might be. One of the things that was fascinating to me with the groups model that we had at the Village for so many years was the idea that what we really needed was to go deeper with fewer people. That's actually what men want to do. They want as few friends as possible. They don't really want to go deep, but they just want as few friends as possible. And sure, I'll figure out a way to go deep with them. Women want a lot of relationships, because we understand that there is a collective thing that happens when we are able to be connected to a larger number of people. If someone gets sick, we can just twinge the spider web and all of a sudden meals show up for everyone. If there's a need, we can meet it through numbers. And so women tend to think in terms of a broader number of relationships than men do. And we do want deep relationships, but we also want more relationships than just 8 people in a small group. So I would say that you want our relational capital, because we tend to be better at forming a lot of relationships. Like my husband is like, I need 2 good friends. And I'm like, I would like 15. So it's just kind of a difference that we have. And I would say that you also need our visible leadership. You need our visible leadership, because the women in your church are looking for women to emulate. And if they do not see women in their church to emulate, they will not look for them anymore. They will go find them outside of your church. And there's a decent chance you will have no idea who they are or what their doctrine or life is like. And those voices will speak very loudly into the lives of your women. So when the Village Church began revisiting our views on complementarianism and on our practice specifically about how this was going to look, we began to realize that in complementarian circles for many years, there had been an emphasis on the wrong syllable. The emphasis, good luck translating that, by the way, Akira, sorry about that. But that the emphasis had been on authority submission. That was what we talked about all the time, right? And I would even see it in super weird ways, like someone would have an anniversary and on Facebook, the wife would say, it's our 23rd anniversary. It's so wonderful the way he leads us so well. And I'd be like, why didn't you just say love? Like, why did you have to say lead? But we rewarded that kind of language because authority submission was the paradigm that we thought was the most important one to talk about all the time. So when we began working on a paper about this, we zoomed out, we tried to get out of the echo chamber of 2 or 3 theologians, and we asked, what is the overarching narrative of the Bible? Is it authority submission or is it something else? And we began to realize that it was, in fact, the church is the family of God. that family is the metaphor that we see from Eden all the way to the New Jerusalem, that all of the one another's in the New Testament are speaking about brothers and sisters, and that all of the epistles are addressing issues of mothers and fathers. And so then the question that we had to ask ourselves was, okay, well, we have brothers and sisters and we have fathers, but are we actually functioning as a single parent home with absentee mothers and an authoritarian father who sets the rules? Because if you had that family in your church, like that literal family, you would be alarmed if that was the state of someone's home, that there's a mother who is either absent or completely silent in all decision-making. If the dad just went into the master bedroom and shut the door and made all the decisions and came out and announced them to everyone else, you would probably be concerned for the well-being of the children and the mother in that home. And yet so often in complementarian churches, we functioned as single parent authoritarian families with heavy-handed fathers and absentee mothers and children who just towed the line. And we thought that there was a more beautiful vision than that outlined for us in the scriptures. And if there was such a thing as mothers and fathers and brothers and sisters, then we wanted visible church mothers so that our women didn't go looking to be mothered somewhere other than the local church. And hear me out. I say this as someone who is a functional church mother to a lot of women in churches that I'm never at. I get that, and I feel the responsibility of that. But they need embodied on the ground women leaders in their church who, if they have a question about something I said in a particular teaching they heard, they can go and have a real conversation. But often those women are missing in our churches because when we think about developing leaders, as Andy pointed out, we think, okay, well, who can be a pastor? That's who I'm going to devote resources to. Well, I'm never going to be a pastor. And that means that I'm not necessarily a target for resources in the way that a man with the same gifting who shows up might be. But not only that, there are real social penalties for me that are just related to my personality and my gifting. Because a man who has the same set of gifts that I do is treated as a superstar. But I get viewed as a usurper. I'm someone who is there to take what's not mine in an authority submission mindset. It means that anytime I'm exercising any kind of leadership gift, I might be trying to take authority that is not mine to take, instead of being seen as someone to whom an authority has been delegated by those who are responsible for doing so, which in our case would be the elder room. So in complementarian churches, frequently I see that authority is regarded as something that's kept in a bucket in the elder room that they're supposed to guard very carefully so that no one gets it. We shifted that mindset. We recognized that because we believe in the priesthood of all believers, it means that elder authority is something that is exercised, but it's also something that is effectively delegated to those who are in leadership at lower levels, both men and women, people who are not in the role of elder, but who are vetted and trained to carry forward the work of the church that falls beyond what the elders are going to be able to accomplish on their own. I have said a lot of words, so I'm going to stop for a minute and see if Andy has any words he would like to say.
Yeah, I mean, my words are to say to keep going. I'm sure there's so much that that you said that's just, I feel like it's good to hear. If you could move a little, like practically. So you've talked, we need to grow in receiving the input. What does that look like? How does that happen? What would be some practical ways that some complementarian churches like ours can begin, if we're not already, welcoming input from women, particularly in the decision making of the church,
Right.
even though they're not elders, they don't need to be elders, but how does that practically happen? And what are some of the challenges that you think that we might face when doing that?
Yeah, well, I do think it's important to remember that when you're looking for outside input in the elder room, it's not necessarily that you're wanting female input, although I do think that's a component of this that's really important. But you're looking for outside input from non-elders, whether male or female. And so this is another big paradigm shift, I think, is, and honestly, I don't know where in the Bible we think that it says that the elder room is a closed door room where men meet and have discussions. Like, that's just not in there. And I'm not saying, I understand that there are sensitive things that are discussed in that room and that the door ought not to always be open. But in most cases, that is a space where you can invite dialogue, and it's healthy to invite dialogue from those who have a perspective that you don't have. So the minute that leadership begins to realize that they need female voices in the room, they have a problem. That is because they don't know female voices they can trust in most cases. Because what we typically say is men and women cannot have relationships with one another unless they're married to one another, because they'll bump into each other and have a baby. And so we have to demystify that a little bit. Let me just speak to that for just a second, because I know I just dropped a bomb on you. But what I am often concerned about is that we have been so fastidious around inappropriate male-female relationships that we have actually taken on the hypersexualized view of the world around us and brought it into the church. It is anti-Christian to say that men and women cannot have relationship with one another unless they are married. That is an anti-Christian sentiment. The idea that men are from Mars and women are from Venus is not found in the Bible. The Bible articulates a vision of the man and the woman created by the same God in the same garden and charged with the same beautiful mission. And so they're also given a work to collaborate on. Now, when sin comes in and clouds the issue, it means that instead of collaborating, they become competitors. They want to rule one another instead of ruling and subdue the creation as they were commanded to do. But when we think about all of the New Testament one another's, we would be foolish to think that what they're saying is, okay, the men are going to handle their one another's over here. The women are going to handle their one another's over here, but there will be no one anothering between the brothers and the sisters because the sex always gets in the way. That is, again, that is a cultural statement. And you're noticing around us that in the culture at large, people have lost their definition for friendship. Any strong feeling for any other person is categorized as romantic or sexual, right? So let it not be so among the children of God. In the church, we should give a compelling vision for siblinghood, brothers and sisters who see one another not as potential sex partners, but as partners in kingdom work, and who trust one another and who invest in friendship with one another. Because the Bible says there is a friend who sticks closer than a brother. Do you hear that? That the most idealized version of friendship the Bible can conceive of is siblinghood. And so if you have a positive relationship with a sibling of the opposite sex, you can relate to this better than someone who doesn't. As you heard in my story, I grew up with 4 brothers. So I know it's possible and I know it can be beautiful. I have enjoyed male friendships all the way through my adult life. That is not to say that I'm unmeasured in the way that I think about them, but we have to take a step back and realize that all relationships involve risk. Relationships between 2 women involve risk. Relationships between 2 men involve risk. Relationships between a man and a woman involve risk. And if we only assign a risk category to male-female friendships, we have dramatically overlooked the way that all relationships are formed. Anytime you meet a new person, you test trust boundaries during each conversation you have. And if a conversation bears more trust, then you walk toward it. And if it gets weird, you take a step back. Doesn't matter what kind of relationship you're talking about. So again, we're not saying be unwise, but we're saying recognize that risk is present in any relationship, and so is reward. So if we only err on the side of caution with the way we think about male-female interactions, guess what we're doing? We're consistently erring only one direction, which means it's like driving your car with the steering wheel only pointed to the right. And it means that you're going to drift too far toward a limiting and a circumscribed understanding of women in the church. They are risks to be mitigated instead of partners to be deployed. So when we start thinking about how are we going to get female voices into leadership spaces, the first place that the minds of male leaders usually goes is to the only women that they can say they might trust, which is their wife or their friends' wives. And in most cases, that means that these are the wives of top leaders in the church. So it's not that these women aren't necessarily the voices that you need in the room, but it's highly unlikely that the wives of the leaders have a normative experience of being a woman in that church. And it's also highly unlikely that those women are going to enter into conversation with male leaders as a disruptive presence. They're going to affirm and they're going to say, that's a great idea and you guys are amazing, but they're not going to go, you know, it was the dumbest thing you guys have ever done. So one of the things that has been amazing to me that has shown, you know, we worked really hard to build trust in male-female relationships at the Village is that I've been invited into a space as a disruptive presence. Like they said, we want you to be in here and we want you to say what you're thinking and we want you to be your true self in this room. You have probably noticed that my true self is perhaps a little too big for some spaces. But because we developed a lot of relational trust, you know, they have welcomed me in. But if you think about how this plays out, like in typical, just a secular organization, female CEOs of companies learn to play golf. You know why? Because they know that decisions are based on trust and relationship. And if they're not on the golf course where the conversation is happening, then they won't be there when trust is handed out. And so in my case, my experience of being a female leader in the church without any real authority to make decisions was that someone else was always in charge of the calendar and the budget. And because I didn't have the relational capital that the men did with one another, the chance that if it was me versus one of those guys and I was going to get the space on the calendar or the budget money was very low, because we give time and resources to the person that we trust. It wasn't that they didn't trust me. It was that they just didn't know me. And they couldn't perceive any real win to getting to know me better. All they could perceive was risk because someone might think that it was inappropriate. But circling back to Andy's question earlier, he said, you know, I can picture how to disciple a man who has a lot of leadership potential. I think if Andy were to list out the things that he would do to disciple that man, there are very few of them that couldn't be done with a female leader as well, in settings where no one would question the intent of you sitting and investing time in her. Now, can you go on an overnight camping trip together? No. But you could make time at the office where there are other people around to invest in her in very real and important ways. And then just to follow up on that, one of the things we've also learned is that because you can't go on a camping trip with her, maybe you should evaluate whether you should go on a camping trip with your male colleague, because it puts her at a relational disadvantage every time that you do. So it doesn't mean that you can't enjoy those friendships, but you have to understand how it's shaping the way that you think about decision making.
How would you broaden that out to not specifically the one or the two kind of identified leaders that we want to kind of intentionally invest in, but more broadly, the discipleship of women in the church? Because I've heard you in previous talks talk about the importance of gender specific discipleship opportunities where female leaders have the opportunity to and welcome to go and invest in them on the one hand, and on the other hand, you saying because of the familial relationships that we should be able to have friendships and relationships with men and women in the church, that there could also be these discipleship relationships that aren't gender specific, that actually indeed are a male leader in the church meeting together with one or two or three leaders in the church for discipleship. So could you speak to any of that and the broader discipleship of women in the church?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm a big fan of a both and approach to discipleship. I think you need single gender spaces for very specific reasons, which I'll touch on. And I also think you need mixed gender spaces. I think it is good for any teaching. So the Village has a very clear definition of what preaching is. It's done by a particular person in a particular setting. It's done by a pastor elder in the gathering, which means that we would not characterize teaching in other environments as something that requires to be done by a pastor elder, which means it can be done by either a man or a woman. So in our practice, that means that if you go to the training program, which is a mixed gender setting, you might hear a man teach or a woman teach a mixed group of people. But then we also have men's Bible study and women's Bible study, which are taught by gender specific teams. And the groups are obviously all gender specific. And I treasure those spaces. I hope they never go away. I think that the mixed gender settings are telling an important part of the story. And I think the single gender settings are as well. One of the reasons that we desperately need single gender settings of women is because reports of abuse are most likely to surface for the first time in those spaces. It is a place where women feel that they can be vulnerable. If they're in an abusive relationship, they already probably have a distrust of men. And if a man is leading the group, they're probably not going to actually give an accurate view of what's going on if they give any view at all. And then anyone who's ever been in a single gender group knows that discussions of sin patterns can get much deeper when there is a specific thing that might be more true of women or more true of men. You can just get to a different level of vulnerability. So I have no desire to clear the table of single gender spaces. I think we need both kinds of spaces. We also need the mixed gender spaces where brothers and sisters are learning with one another. And I cannot say this strongly enough. If we could learn the beauty of brother sisterly affection in the church, I truly think in this generation, that is what would set us apart as a city on a hill.
I can just only imagine that over the many years, there have been times where you specifically have been overlooked or maybe hurt by not given opportunities or being able to serve in ways that you feel God has gifted you. I am sure there are women in our churches who have felt the same way. What kind of reflections might you have on that? And how would you want to advise those of us who are pastors and leaders in the churches to reach out to women leaders who may have been overlooked or hurt if this is an area where we have struggled in the past?
Yeah, I mean, it definitely has been a challenge. And I have sometimes joked, but only half jokingly, that I've had a really easy marriage to Jeff Wilkin. And I think that that's because I was going to have a really difficult marriage to the local church. And so I think that the Lord, and during one of the most difficult seasons that I had with my local church, the Lord made sure that my husband and my kids were all plugged in and serving and thriving. I was the only one who didn't really have a place to exercise my gifts. And so I was able to stay tethered, even though I might have wanted to make a break for it. And I'm thankful for that because I do think it's a long game. It does take longer for women to gain trust, and it's just going to. I mean, maybe not 20 years from now, but certainly right now it does. And so that means that if you're a woman with a leadership gift or with a contribution to make, you're going to have to put your big girl pants on and be patient with the process. Because again, no one's a villain. Like this is at best a sin of omission. It's not a sin of commission. When pastors attend seminary, they are told to be careful around women. And so it takes time for that messaging to diminish in their minds and for them to be able to give themselves permission to build trust in non-threatening situations. They have to unlearn and relearn a lot. And I find that even when they very much want to, there's just so much muscle memory around the old way of doing things that it just isn't intuitive for a very long time. And so if I was going to get my feelings hurt every time something happened that was not well considered, or every time I raised a valid view and I wasn't heard, then I'm more concerned with my own feelings than I am with the needs of those who I am advocating for. And so I think it's important to recognize that if you decide to take this on, you're a servant in this. Like you are there on behalf of others. You're not there to make yourself awesome or to even make yourself be heard. You're there because you believe what your contribution is indispensable to the church. It's something that the church desperately needs, and you're walking toward that need, even if it's at personal cost. So you have to be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry. And you gotta think about how you're most likely to be heard. I asked at the point that I was being put into leadership rooms that I not be the only female voice that was put in the room at that time. I needed another female voice in there with me. Otherwise, my input becomes, that's just Jen. Instead of an ability for the two of us, or now it's the three of us, to be able to say, no, we're all seeing this. And so that was a really important piece for me. And I think for pastors or for leaders who look back and go, oh, shoot, I have really blown this. Don't waste a lot of time feeling ashamed and get stuck and not able to move forward. We're really not holding it against you in the way that you might hold it against yourself. We understood what we were getting into. And so, and even if you have to apologize multiple times, and even if it's in fits and starts, the effort is so appreciated. It just is so appreciated. And I would say, when I first began to recognize that I was seen as a relational gain instead of a relational threat, man, I came alive, because I was like, this is what I remember with my brothers. This is what I remember. That's what I know with my husband. And so that to me was a sign that we were getting to a healthy place, that it wasn't that they were just trying to take care of the women problem, but that and then I had this really sweet moment with a male colleague where I said to him, I said, I know, I'm very aware, I understand the beauty of all male groups. I really do. I have all the brothers, I understand the beauty of it. And I told him, I feel some sadness that by putting me in the room, I have ruined the vibe. It's not the same room that it was before. Like when I got on the executive team, they called it SEAL Team 6. That was what they called it. And then I got on the team. So I definitely showed up for the first meeting wearing a wetsuit just to mess with them. But it was just very different. And so I told him, I'm sorry. I know that I sort of ruined the boys club. And he said to me, you're thinking about this completely wrong. He said, we didn't put you in the room because we had to. We put you in the room because we knew not that it would be different, but that it would be actually better. Like, it's better for you. It's not just different or good. It is better than it was when it was an all male space. And he said, we don't feel it yet. Like, we're still having to learn our way toward that, but I believe that we'll get there. And he was right. We have, it took us 3 years probably to get to that place. But now, we wouldn't trade it for anything. And in fact, we did a survey of the men and women on staff around like employee satisfaction. And one of the questions was, if you could get the same job at a different church with more money, would you take it? And the men were kind of like, I mean, maybe. And the women were like, heck no, because we know there's probably not another place we can go where things are going to be as good as they are here. Like, we know we're ahead of the curve, and we've done a lot of hard work that a lot of other churches are only starting to think about. But that's what I would say to you guys. If you're skeptical about this, just know that we started working on this quietly, and we didn't start talking about it until we could say, yeah, this is actually beautiful in practice. It's not hypothetical. It is genuinely better.
Okay, this is my it's my last question, and then we'll open it up to some questions to some others. But as you talk about this, I'm getting the sense you're a fairly strong personality. You have opinions on things, and you're willing to speak your mind, which is beautiful. It's great. Not every woman is like that.
That's right.
And yet even they have a voice that needs to be heard. They may not be as quick to step up and to get out there. So can you speak to that? And maybe it's more natural for you to kind of have that voice, but how can we invest in, identify, disciple, hear that voice from maybe your kind of personality, and then others as well?
Yeah, I've actually spent a lot of time trying to think this through. I have more of a masculine communication style than a feminine one. I am direct. There is no subtext, and I am not easily offended. And so, and I'm sure that's a product of, the way that I grew up, and I knew how to communicate to earn the respect of my brothers or, whoever. And so I know that's part of it. And I've reflected on how one of the reasons that I was one of the first women invited into a leadership space at my own church was because I communicated the way that the men did. And I view myself as a first wave. Like, I think that the next couple of waves of female leaders that will come in behind me may not communicate in the same way that I do. And I hope that they won't, because we don't need just my kind of voice in a room. In the same way that you don't want the men to all have the same way of presenting in a leadership room, you want women of varying personalities and communication styles to be valued in their input. So I think that it was relatively easy for that initial room of leaders to say, okay, we can see, you know, once we kind of like set aside the stereotype associated with a woman who communicates the way that Jen does, and we saw her as a partner and an ally, we actually like her communication style because we don't have to worry a whole lot about, you know, stepping on her toes. But I do think that we have been able to start bringing in the voices of other women who do communicate across a wider spectrum of styles, and that's extra healthy for that room. So yeah, I think there should be places. I will say this, historically, my kind of voice has been the one that is unwelcome, both in the secular workplace and even more so in churches. So I don't know if you guys are into the Enneagram or if you think that's the devil's workshop, but I was forced to go to a seminar on the Enneagram. I was like, I don't care about the Enneagram. And the guy stood up and read a description of eights. And I was looking around this room full of people I didn't know very well. And I was like, well, I don't like this. This feels really uncomfortable. And then he said, if you are a male 8 in the church, you are celebrated or in the world, you're celebrated and promoted and put in charge of things. And if you're a female 8, we call you something very specific. And he said the word. And then he said, the only thing harder than being a female 8 in the secular workplace is being a female 8 in the church. At which point I began sobbing in front of a whole room full of people I didn't know very well, because I was like, oh my goodness, that is my history. That is my history. It's that if I show up the way that I really am, I'm a liability instead of an asset. And so those are things that we worked through at the Village, and I'm so grateful. But they are obstacles that are still out there for many women that keep us from operating as brothers and sisters. So yeah, something to be aware of.
Wow. Well, there's a whole bunch here for us to think through and to hopefully change. I'd love to be able to open it up, Jen, to questions to those who are here. Any question that, anything that you have said that has sparked an idea or a question to all of you who are here, I would love to give you the opportunity to ask Jen. So what I'm gonna stop simultaneous translation, and we're gonna switch to back and forth translation. So we'll do that. If you have a question, I'm gonna ask you to unmute yourself, ask your question, let Akira translate it into Japanese, and then Jen can answer, stopping every sentence or two to allow for translation. So I'm gonna go ahead and stop translation. Okay.
はい、今、逐日通訳に切り替わりました。
So yeah, if you have a question, please feel free to unmute yourself and ask away.
はい、質問がある方は自分のミュートを外して、質問してください。ちゃんと、通訳する時間も、間に入れてください。
Can I ask a question?
せっちゃんが。
Okay.
メガンが質問があります。
Thanks, Jen, for what you've shared. Really appreciate it.
ジェンさん、今日は本当にありがとうございました。
I'm curious as a mom of 4. I'm also a mom of 4.
子供が4人いる母親として聞きたいことがあります。
With raising boys and girls, just very broadly speaking, how have you helped shape your kids' idea of complementarianism or of helping girls understand leadership in the church the whole thing, anything related to
で
parenting. I'm
で、う
curious
ちには
about.
男の子も女の子もいるんですけれども、男の子、女の子もうどちらにも相互主義とか、教会のリーダーシップとか、そういう役割とか、そういうことをどういうふうに、子供に教えてきましたかというのが質問ですね。
Yeah, well, I mean, any parent knows that we parent each child individually based on personality and strengths and weaknesses.
で、どんな親も、子育てっていうのはもうなんか一般的な子育て論があるわけではなくて、本当にそれぞれの子供に合わせた子育てをしますよね。
And I don't pretend to be an expert on complementarian theology, but I do have some thoughts on how we can best understand it.
で、相互主義的神学のエキスパートとして話すつもりはありませんけども、いくつか考えていることはあります。
So I have seen things directed at parents that say, teach your boys how to lead and teach your girls how to submit.
で、男の子には、リードするように教え、女の子には従うように教えましょうみたいな、ことを言ってる教えを見たことがありますが、
And I would not go that route.
そこは、
I would-
全然お勧めできません。
I know you're surprised.
びっくりです
I
よ
would
ね。
talk instead about agency and vulnerability.
で、私は本当にその、なんていうか、代表っていうか、そういうような感じと、あと、脆さもしくは弱さをちゃんとさらけ出すっていうところを教えていきたいなというふうに思ってます。
And so those are categories that apply loosely to men and women. Men enjoy more agency and women understand vulnerability.
で、男の子、男性はどちらかというと代表になるとか、そういうようなことを、重視する部分があるし、女の子は脆さとか弱さをさらけ出すっていうことをどちらかと好む習性がありますよね。
And we have something to learn from each other. So I think that men offer agency to women and women help men rediscover vulnerability.
で、だからその点において男の子が男性が女性にそれを教えることもできるし、女性の方が脆さとかそういうのを男性に教えることもできると思うんです。
But when we think about in general, all of us have some degree of agency that someone else doesn't enjoy. And we also have people we can learn from a vulnerability standpoint. So it's good for both boys and girls to consider how they have agency and how they understand vulnerability.
ですので、男性も女性も脆さと、Could you actually expound a little bit more of like what you mean by agency? Because I don't think I'm translating it right.
It's the ability to make your own decisions free of others' input.
Okay. Got it. で、そのさっきからエージェンシーっていうのを多分僕ちゃんと訳してなかったんですけども、自分でいろいろ決断していくとかそういう感じですね。で、男性も女性も、それを、学んでいく必要があります。そうやって自分で、決断していくこと。そして、vulnerability の方は脆さをさらけ出すということですね。それ両方とも、学んでいく必要があると思います。Thank you, Jen.
I'll add one more thing.
で、もう一個あります。
I think it's important for us to have a paradigm for female bravery and female strength. Those are often not talked about by complementarians.
で、女性の、勇敢さ、what was the second one? Bravery?
Female bravery and female
Bravery
strength.
Strength. で、女性の勇敢さ、そして女性の力っていうのを、あんまりこれは双方主義の教会とかで話されてないなと思うんですけども、それも話していく必要があると思います。
Thank you. That's great, Jen.
ありがとうございます。
Jen, when women in the church don't see women leaders visibly in the church, what have you experienced happens? What are the consequences, both for the ladies in the church and then also for the church?
で、教会の中で目に見える部分で女性がリードしている姿が見えてないとき、そういうのが見えない教会では、 まあ、男性にも女性にもどんな良くない結果が、伴ってきましたか？
Like even someone as a visible women leader, I could see a person in New Hampshire, a lady who's in a church, go to you or go to some other voice that they hear. It could be good, that it could not be good, but what's your experience been?
で、目に見える女性としてジェンさんを知ってる人は、もう全然違う州の人でも、ジェンさんのところにアドバイス聞きに行ったりするわけですよね。まあ、なのでどう思いますか？
I think there is a liability for the women who are just going to leave because they don't think there's a place for them to serve. And then there's a liability for the woman who's going to stay because she thinks that there shouldn't be a place for her to serve.
で、もう本当になんか自分はもう使える場所がないなっていうふうに思って、去っていく女性もいれば、もうなんかそれでもその教会にとどまっていく人にとっても良くないことだというふうに思います。
So if a woman comes to your church and she sees that there are no women visibly leading, so let's say on a Sunday morning, a woman can't even offer a prayer, then she may believe that a theological trade is necessary for her to exercise her gifts, instead of the problem being with an application of theology that translates into a beautiful practice.
だから例えば皆さんの教会に日曜日に誰か新しい女性が来たとして、でその教会で女性が全く何もすることが許されてなかったとして、もうお祈りをすることすらもできなかったとして、それを見たその女性はそういうふうに自分自身が賜物をこの教会で発揮するためには、神学的なトレーニングを積まなければいけないんだなというふうに勘違いしてしまうわけですね。でも本当のところ間違ってるのは、足りてないのは神学的なトレーニングとか理解ではなくて、神学の適用が間違ってるだけなんですけども、そういうふうに思ってしまうわけです。
And I think we've seen that. I think we've seen an exodus of some of our most gifted women leaders to churches that are more theologically liberal because we have not given a good interpretation to our practice. And I think that's terrible.
で、実際に私たちのこの相補主義の教会の群れからもうちょっと自由神学的な方に素晴らしい女性のリーダーたちが流れていってしまっているっていうのも、やっぱり私たち相補主義の教会がちゃんとその相補主義っていうのが聖書でどういうふうに教えられているのかっていうのを考えずに、それを適用せずにしているから起こってしまっている結果だと思うんです。
But then I also have concern for the woman who stays in that church and believes that it's normative for there not to be women who are visible in leadership, because it means that future female leaders are not emerging in that church.
でそれに加えて、この教会ダメだわっていうふうに去っていく女性とは反対に、そういうのを見ていても、それでもなんかしょうがないなって思って、その教会にとどまっていく女性にとっても良くないなっていうのは何でかっていうと、もうそれが普通だというふうに思ってしまうから、新しい女性のリーダーが全く育たない教会になってしまうという結果が、伴ってくるからだと思います。
And so more often than not, you'll find that in motherless churches, you have an atrophied vision for female discipleship. Women are not taken seriously as disciples.
だからこそ、もうなんかさっきも言っていたように、もう教会の母がいない状態の教会もの実質父子家庭になってしまっている教会っていうのは、全くリーダーが育たない状態になってしまうし、女性の弟子訓練っていうのも危機的状態に陥ってしまうわけですね。
And one of the reasons that I do what I do and that I'm okay with my head being on a screen in other people's churches is because I know that some women can't even conceive of doing what I'm doing until they see me do it.
で、私がどっかでメッセージしたのが他の教会でスクリーンに現れるっていうのが、それを良しとしている理由の一つとしては、私がそういうふうに教える文脈があるっていうのを、その他の教会の女性は見るまでそれが普通、それが許されていることだっていうのを理解できないと思うから、それはそれでいいなというふうに思って良しとしています。
But ideally, they see a woman in their own church who's setting that standard for them, if not in this generation, in the next.
けれども理想としては、もうそういうふうになんかスクリーン上に映ってる私ではなくて、その教会の中からの女性リーダーが、リーダーとして活躍しているっていうのを、女性たちが見ていけたらいいなというふうに思います。それが私たちの世代でなくて、その次の世代でも、もう本当にそれが実現してほしいなというふうに熱望しています。
Chad's got a question now, if that's okay.
Yeah.
チャドがなんか言うみたいです。
そうです。One of the things that we really value as a network, and even a phrase you'll hear often, is that we want to trust the word of God even more than our own efforts.
で、私たちのネットワークの中で、私たちは私たち自身の努力とかやってることよりも神の言葉に信頼するっていうフレーズが結構あるんですけれども。
And so in our context, we're surrounded by 99% non-Christians. And so there's very little biblical worldview understanding and framework for what the Bible says and teaches in most of our ministries on a very regular and frequent basis.
で、私たちの周り、私たちの置かれている文脈っていうのは 99% 以上の人がクリスチャンではないという文脈なので、その聖書の教えとか聖書が言っていること、その価値観とか教えっていうのが全く通用していない、世の中に私たちは置かれているわけですよね。
And so while this is true in any context in the world, I think in a unique way in our context, there are cultural gender roles that have been created, established, and subscribed to that don't necessarily reflect biblical values and truth.
で、私たちが置かれている文脈では、この聖書が教えている双方主義とかそういうような、教えが全然通じていない場所にいるわけです。
And so we want to, in general, take steps towards a broad church-wide biblical literacy. Could you speak to practical steps towards establishing patterns, rhythms, or good practices, just of female biblical literacy in our church? Yeah, could you speak to that?
で、私たちはもうネットワーク中の教会が本当にもう男性も女性もですけれども、聖書をちゃんと自分で読んで理解するもう聖書識字率というか、そういうのがちゃんと上がっていくことを願っているわけですけども、そのために私たちが用いていったらいいんじゃないかっていうパターンとか、そういうようなやり方っていうのがあったら教えてください。
Yeah, I think for those who are just beginning on a Bible literacy journey, they need to have some basic tools to get started.
聖書識字率を上げていきたいというふうに思ってるんだったら、もう本当にまず、なんていうかもう本当にベーシックなツールから始めていったらいいと思います。
First, I think they need the story of Scripture. They need the big story of the Bible from start to finish.
で、まずは聖書全体の物語っていうのが最初から最後までどういう流れなのかっていうのを知っている必要があると思うんでね。
I think they need to be taught that it's 66 books telling the same story in different ways.
で、人々は聖書がもう66巻すべてが同じストーリーを教えてる一つの本であるっていうのを教えられる必要があると思います。
And then I think we need to give them an approach that means they're studying entire books of the Bible. The first step of doing that is to just read repetitively a book from start to finish.
で、聖書の66巻の、どの本でもそうですけれども、まずその一つの本に、一つの書簡に、注目して学ぶことも必要だと思います。で、そのためには、まずその第一歩としては、何度も何度もその本を、繰り返し読んでいくということですね。
And I think a great gift that you can give to a group of people who might not come in with the same preconceptions that an American audience has is the beauty of learning in community. In the United States, we place such a priority on your individual time in the Word. And I think that's not really the most beneficial time that we have, although it's one step.
で、アメリカでは結構個人主義的に聖書が読まれてるなっていうふうに思うんですけれども、全然聖書を知らない人が多い、もう 99% 以上が聖書を知らないっていうこういう文脈で学んでいくためには、もう本当にそれをむしろ利用してコミュニティとして一緒に学んでいくっていうのも必要だなと、むしろそれが素晴らしいんじゃないかなというふうに思います。
The Bible was written to be read and discussed in groups. And so while individual reading is a starting point, as soon as you can get them into a space where they are dialoguing, then that is what I would do. I would not underestimate the formative power of just that repetitive reading piece and just marking insights as they go as a basis for discussion.
で、聖書はもともと一人で読むものとして書かれてなくて、コミュニティの中で読まれるものとして、声に出して読まれて、人が聞くというものとして書かれている部分というのもあるので、本当にやっぱり一緒に繰り返し読んでいく、そして繰り返し読んでいく中で気づいたこととか疑問点とかそういうのを書き出していって、で、そこから人々がそれについて話していく、会話をしていく、で、その会話の部分に持っていけたらもうこっちの勝ちだというふうに思います。
Yeah, and then one last thing I would add, which is the most predictable thing I'd ever say, is to give them a vision of the Bible as a book that speaks first about God, because too often we see it as a place for self-discovery before we understand it as a place where we enter into deeper relationship with God Himself.
で、これも本当に当たり前すぎることかなっていうふうに思うんですけれども、まず聖書っていうのが、私たち人間がもうなんか自己発見、自己開発のために自己啓発的に読む本ではなくて、聖書っていうのは神について、教えてくれる本であるっていうのを、教えていく必要があるわけです。
Jen, if you don't mind, our churches in Mustard Seed Network are complementarian, but you don't have to share that conviction to be a church member.
で、私たちの教会は相互主義的な教会ですけれども、教会メンバーになるためには相互主義である必要はありません。
But if there was an intelligent, gifted in leadership, maybe even teaching, female church member who by conviction was not complementarian, what would be the parameters that you would advise in elevating their visible leadership or their voice in church leadership?
けれども、私たちの教会に、相互主義ではなくて、どちらかというと対等主義的な、理解を持っている女性の教えたりリーダーシップの賜物が与えられている人がいたとしたら、その人の成長を促していくために、その人に声を与えるとか、そういうためにはどういうステップを踏んでいったらいいと思いますか？
Yeah, vetting people for leadership always involves building trust. So I would work to build relational trust.
で、本当にどんな人がリーダーとして成長していくためにも、やっぱり最初の一歩っていうのは、信頼関係を築いていくことなので、やっぱり誰かその人との信頼関係を築くっていうことから始めていったらいいんだろうなというふうに思います。
Because if you have trust, it means that there's mutual respect for other people's boundaries. And then you have a basis for saying, we see your gifting, we want to utilize you. We would ask that you abide by our convictions. Are you able to do so?
で、まずそういうふうに信頼関係が築かれているんだとしたら、もうその信頼関係という土台の上でいろんな会話をしていくことができるようになるわけですよね。で、それで信頼関係あるなっていうふうにちゃんと分かったら、そこで私たちはもうあなたにこんなに素晴らしい賜物が与えられているっていうのを見て、もう本当に分かっているし、それを用いていってほしいなというふうに感じているんだけども、私たちの教会はこういう相互主義の、考えを持っているので、そこに合わせてくれませんかという会話をしていく必要がしていけるんじゃないかなというふうに思います。
My dog is snoring audibly.
I was wondering what it was, but I was just thinking it's probably the dog.
I would just add to that last question, Andy, it's important to remember complementarianism is not a test of orthodoxy.
で、もう一つ、さっきの、質問に加えると、いうことを加えると、相互主義っていうのは、もうキリスト教の初歩的な中心部分の譲ってはいけない、神学ではないっていうのを、やっぱりはっきりさせておいた方がいいなと思います。
So at my church, we call it a doctrinal distinctive, and we liken it to a spice that you cook with.
で、私たちの教会では、神学的特徴というふうにそれを呼んでいて、もう本当になんか 料理の中で使っていくスパイスのような、感じですよね。
So if you don't like hot chili sauce and we're using too much hot chili sauce, you may decide that you don't want to keep dining here.
で、私たちの、このレストランで使ってる、ホットチリソースが皆さんがあなたがあんまり好きじゃないんだったら、他のレストランに行ってもいいですよというふうになるわけですね。
And we would understand and we would still love you. But there might be a level of spice that you can live with and still serve here happily.
けれども、私たちが使うスパイスの中、あなたにとってのその許容量があるんだったら、その許容量まで許容してもらって、このコミュニティの中で過ごしてもらうっていうこともできるんじゃないかなっていうふうにも伝えることができると思います。
Yeah, I think the piece that takes wisdom and trust, like you said, is when their level of service is by definition influential or teaching to others. As you said, are they comfortable in serving or teaching or leading in such a way that doesn't go against those particular doctrinal convictions?
I'm sorry, totally spaced out. Can you say that again?
Oh yeah, I was just saying, like, yeah, the issue that requires wisdom and trust is when they're serving in areas in which they're influencing or teaching, to make sure that there's this understanding that here's what our doctrinal distinctives are.
Yes.
Are you comfortable in serving or leading, maybe teaching in such a way that doesn't go against those particular convictions?
で簡単に言うと、もうその人との、信頼関係があって、もう会話をしている中で、その人に私たちの教会の神学的特徴っていうのはこの部分で、ここからここまでが私たちが、持ってる枠組みで、その中で教えたり、影響を及ぼしたりしていくっていうことを私たちはしてほしいと思ってるんですけども、それを超えるのはダメなんですけども、どうですかっていうふうな、ちゃんとそういうような会話をしていくっていうのがやっぱり知恵が一番必要な部分かなというふうに思います。
I agree. I think that there's an assumption that it would come up frequently, and honestly, it just doesn't. The Bible does not have a ton to say about this, and I can happily teach for a long time without bumping into difficult spaces on this.
で、このトピック、双方主義、対等主義のトピックって聖書にそこまでなんかめちゃめちゃはっきりとでっかい文字で書かれているものでもないので、それについて、長く教えようと思ったら教えることはできるなというふうに思います。
But I will say, complementarianism is not a clearly defined position. It tends to be a range. And so whatever your local church's position is, it's important to be clear. Because otherwise women are having to chameleon themselves into whatever space they're in as best they can.
けれども本当に重要な部分っていうのは双方主義っていうのももう本当にいろんな教会で程度があるわけですね。それは聖書の中で双方主義がもうなんかこの双方主義といえばこれしかないっていうような定義をはっきり書いてるわけではないので、双方主義っていうふうに聞いただけで、それを聞いた双方主義じゃない人たちがしてしまう、勘違いとか早とちりとかもあると思うし、双方主義っていう言葉を聞いただけでそれはこういう意味だよねっていうふうに思う双方主義の人たちもいるわけで、そういう部分をちゃんと私たちの教会はこういう双方主義ですよっていうのをはっきり明確に会話の中で信頼が成り立った上でしていく必要はあると思います。
I'll add one more thing. You mentioned authority, teaching with authority. I assume you're referencing I do not permit a woman to teach or hold authority. That is a passage that it requires a lot of wisdom to think through.
で、パウロが、第一コリントでしょうか、で話している私は女性が教会で話すことを、良しとしませんという聖書箇所はありますけれども、その箇所自体も本当に知恵を持って、取り扱っていく必要がありますよね。
It's important to recognize that all teaching is authoritative. Whether you're a kindergarten teacher teaching kindergartners, when you step in to teach, you carry authority. The question is, what kind of authority?
で、 それがどんな教えるという行動であっても、それが幼稚化で、教えることでも、そこには権威が伴ってくるわけですよね。なので、その権威っていうのがどういうものなのかっていうのもちゃんと考える必要があると思います。
So when I teach women's Bible study, am I teaching with authority? Yes, in one sense I am, but not with elder authority.
なので、私が、女性のバイブルスタジオを教えているときには、そこには権威が伴っているかというと、権威を伴っているわけですけれども、そこの権威、私が発揮している権威というのは、長老の権威ではないっていうことははっきり、してますね。
But in another sense, I'm teaching with elder authority in the sense that I have been vetted by them and I submit myself to the doctrine that they have set.
けれども、それは私自身が長老であって、その長老としての権威を発揮しているわけではないというだけで、長老からその権威を持って任されて、権威を持って教えているというふうにも見ることができます。
And you're saying you would be teaching with the same kind of authority if you were teaching for that women's Bible study, or if you were teaching for this kind of what you were describing before, this mixed gendered group as well.
Yes.
That's right.
で、今はっきりさせて明確にしておきたかったのが、ジェーンさんが言ってるのは、女性のバイブルスタディでも、男女混ざった男女混合のグループで教えることでも、使ってる、権威っていうのは、伴っている権威っていうのは同じということですよね。で、それに対する答えは、そうですでした。
We have time if there is one more question for one more question.
はい。
So I just want to throw that out there before we
質問
conclude.
があるとしたら、もう一個だけ質問できるかなっていうくらいの時間が残ってますけども、いかがでしょうか。
So I have one question. First of all, Jen, thank you for sharing with us and for the dignity that you give to men and women in the way that you talk about
ジェ
ministry.
ンさん、今日は本当にありがとうございました。私、質問が一個あります。
I just want to ask, like historically, what have you found to be helpful in talking to men or women who are considering whether they should leave the local church because of this issue?
で、双方主義、対等主義の問題を理由に、教会を去ろうかなというふうに思っている人に、どういうふうに話すことがいいというふうに、思ってますか？
I do think it's important for leadership to reflect on whether they've had too restrictive a practice or not. It may be that you haven't, but it's important to ask the question.
で、そういう場合に、教会は教会として自分たちが持っているポリシーっていうのが、それまで設定して、それで教会を運営してきていた双方主義に関する、双方主義、対等主義に対する関するポリシーが厳しすぎたかどうかっていうのをちゃんと振り返って考えてみる必要はあると思います。それが厳しすぎなかったとしてもですね。
For example, at the village, we recognized that historically we had operated from a place of fear and restrictiveness instead of a place of Christian freedom.
で、例えば私のビレッジ教会では、私たちの教会でこの件に関しては本当に、恐れと、そして縛りっていうのがもうなんていうか一番、腹の底にあるモチベーションとしてあったわけですよね。
And what this meant was that we were designing a practice based on Genesis 3 instead of on Genesis 1 and 2 or Revelation 21 and 22.
で、私たち、それはどういうことかっていうと、私たちの教会の運営方法、そのポリシーっていうのは、創世記の3章に基づいたもので、創世記の1章、2章、そして、黙示録の21章に基づいたものではなかったわけです。
We were asking what should we protect instead of what's the beautiful vision.
私たちは何を守るべきなのかに注目していて、何が本当に美しいビジョンなのかっていうのは見てなかった。
Now, you may reframe things and still find that people want to leave your church because they see you as restrictive, but you can have a clear conscience before the Lord if you've done the work yourself.
で、もう皆さんの教会で私たちは双方主義っていう時にどういうことなのかっていうのをちゃんと見返して、それを吟味して で、いろいろ何個か変えたとして、で、それでも教会を去っていく人は去っていくでしょうけれども、皆さんはそれをちゃんと聖書の前に、御言葉の前に、御言葉の元に座って、それをちゃんと考えて決めたという良心があるので、皆さんは、それで去っていったのは残念だけども、私たちは聖書に基づいてちゃんとやってるんだなというふうに、思うことができる。
We have people leave our church because they think we're too restrictive and because they think we're too loose, which tells me we're probably in a good spot.
で、私たちの教会では、なんというか、ちょっと厳しすぎなんじゃないのっていうふうに去っていく人もいるし、ちょっとそれはルーズすぎるんじゃないのというふうに言って去っていく人もいるので、結構多分いいバランスが取れてるんだろうなというふうに思います。
Thank you.
ありがとうございます。
Yes, thank you, Jen, so much.
ありがとうございます。
You might want to get a sleep study for your dog.
No, that's part of their charm.
Oh, is that right? Okay.
Yeah, we paid extra for that.
はい。
Hey, thank you so much. People support our ministry in many ways. They give, they pray. Thank you for supporting us by teaching. It's a unique way that folks can support us. So I appreciate that greatly.
教えることを通して私たちをサポートしてくれてありがとうございます。
You've given us a lot to think about, but hopefully more than just thinking. I really do hope and pray that we implement what you've talked about today. So thank you.
Thank you for trusting me with this time.
学んでいきたいと思います。ありがとうございます。